be on the Marketing and Media Show with Hasanain Abdullah. Halala 786, halala!
To make sense of the world, we rely on newsmakers and media professionals who, through their analysis of current news, help us make sense of the news. At the intersection where the world of media and marketing meets, join me as I engage with seasoned media industry professionals who share their rich work experience. These conversations are shaped by the ever-evolving environment influenced by the development in digital media. Welcome to the Media and Marketing Show. My name is Hasanain Abdullah and I'll be your host. Today we are joined by Farid Sayed. He started his reporting when a typewriter was a weapon and a banning order was a badge of honor. At Muslim News, he started out as a trainee journalist, evolved to the senior reporter, and then subsequently the editor until its banning order during the state of emergency during the 1986 era. As the founding editor of Muslim Views, in a publication that has the biggest circulation numbers in South Africa, we will be engaging with him and finding out about his rich media career as a journalist as well as the editor of the publication. He is no stranger to radio. He hosted the NRA, the News Reviews, a very popular program, I might add, from 2006 to 2011 on Radio 786. He was the executive of the Media Association of South Africa way back in 1978 and currently is a member of the Hospital Welfare and Muslim Educational Movement. It's an absolute pleasure to be engaging with Farid today in his discussion, and the focus of this discussion will be his role as the editor of Muslim Views. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and you're welcome, Mr. Farid Sayed.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's good to be back on radio, albeit on the other side of the mic. But thank you for inviting me to share some thoughts, Hasanain.
Thank you so much. You know, I really miss you listening to your program, your analysis on hard news and the current news on NRA. So I'm glad that I've been able to persuade you to and invite you for this media discussion. To kick off our discussion, I want to find out what is the secret sauce to longevity, to surviving in the media space. As the editor of Muslim Views, you have outlived global recessions, a pandemic, the rumbles of world wars. What's the secret sauce on not just surviving, but also remaining relevant and still being in business while other titles or publications have closed their doors?
Well, from a personal point of view, maybe it's a bit of insanity. Who would be, which logical, rational person would stick around for so long in the media space, and with all its challenges. But that's just on a lighter note. But it does take a bit of throwing away or setting aside logic and rationality. If you're just going to base everything on logic, does it make sense, to continue with the paper? And we would have given up long ago. Probably Muslim News, that closed. And logic perhaps dictated at that time it should close. And then Muslim Views started, and we went through many phases. And probably there were, I would say, about 3 definite occasions where the thought was, okay, I think it's time to call it quits, because of the challenges, not because of a lack of passion, not because we felt that we'd done our job or print media had done its job, but I think just the sheer weight of the challenge of economics. In the earlier years, it was about banning orders, etc. So I think there's no real secret as such, but I think it needs a bit of passion. But I think also a vision that media, the less media you have, the less titles, the fewer titles that you have, the fewer radio stations that you have. And if people start sort of saying, look, it's time that we close shop, I think that space is taken up by someone else. And I'm talking particularly coming from an alternative media background. And perhaps we'll touch on that aspect.
No, definitely. I think we'll touch on it on our next question. And I want to touch on this point of the technological tsunami. It's some sort of a term maybe that we can associate just to describe over the last 6 years. There has been a quantum leap in technology. And this what brings me to my next question. When was the moment that you realized that smartphone pixels were going to replace ink on envelope print? Every person equipped with a smartphone is a citizen journalist, and we've seen the rise of user-generated content. In this context of media, everyone has an opinion and is driven by a need to express it. How has the publication stayed in vogue?
Yeah, I think, on a personal note, you spoke about the quantum leap in technology. So I don't know, Hasanain, if this was perhaps before your era, but in your introduction, you spoke about the typewriter. And
Olivetti typewriter.
It was an Olivetti typewriter. At some stage, the office typewriter was an electric Remington, which was like a leap. And this brings me to your question and the point I want to make. So the typewriter, when I entered the industry, in fact, as a youngster, I was still at primary school, where I had maybe access, one could put it, to a printing press and to see the Muslim news in its early days from 1960, 61, seeing it published and printed. They used lead, actual lead, heavy stuff, and they had the stray and there was the lead made an impression on the paper, and old style, people who did lino cuts at school perhaps will know that
sort of
technique. Like a posi, but this was like solid type. And then it evolved. So when I joined Muslim News in 1975, prior to that already, there was this kind of, I wouldn't even call it a leap, maybe a creep, towards technology. And so it was a system where one would have had to touch type. So we still use the typewriter. And then the typed copy would go to the typesetter, and that person would sit and touch type. And on a ticket tape, this little thing will come with all the little blocks and everything, and that will be run through a processor. And you would find what we call galleys, long, sheets with your story, with the headline, etc. And then you still have to cut and paste. Now, cut and paste not in an electronic form, but cut and paste physically with scissors and glue. So that kind of maybe, in one sense, this technological tsunami, maybe it came as a bit of a shock to me, because I evolved, or as technology evolved, rather, I sort of adapted, but it gave you a lot of time to adapt. I mean, if one talks about a household, and no, you don't have to, if the listeners and viewers who are maybe from my generation, they would know that they had a telephone. I actually, grew up on a little small holding where you had to pick up the phone, and an operator would answer, and you would say "Nommer asseblief." It was reality, not a TV program.
The 70s?
No, 60s.
Sure.
1960, I'm talking of 61, 62. Nommer asseblief, and then they would connect you, and you would tell them, what number you want, etc. When we came to Cape Town, I said, wow, what is this new technology? The phone had a kind of a dial, and that thing would swing back, etc., right? Then it took many, many years before you had a keypad, but it's all, landline. So just to, that alone is a discussion how technology up to the 70s, 80s really, moved in a very, it crept along. And then the 90s come, I mean, probably we could say, the 90s come along, and there's just like before you're getting used to your phone, and you see an advert, well, there's an upgrade, So I think it does take one by surprise. But in the media space, you're fascinated with the technology. You say, wow, smart stuff. But then you realize it also poses a challenge as to how you, as a media practitioner, let's call it that, how are you going to sort of adapt? How is your publication? And I'm talking publication because we're talking about print media. How is print media really going to adapt to this kind of change? I don't think in the early years, when the smartphone made its presence, I don't think one realized, I personally didn't realize that it's going to have such an impact in terms of not only news gathering, but how people consume news. And I use the word consume kind of advisedly, because sometimes people just consume news, they don't digest it, etc. And I think with the smartphone, it's easy to consume news. Now I realize that, and I said, okay, because people are consuming news, we still have a role to play as print media and as long-form media. But certainly with the smartphone, when it made its entry, it came as a bit of a shock and a challenge, and I think there was a bit of negativity as well, So look, it's not that we were being kind of anti-technology or anything of that sort, but we just felt that, if it's going to take over media, you mentioned citizen journalism, and I'm sort of fast-tracking to where we are now. You see, is there really, it's a term that one could really engage with, unpack and challenge, citizen journalism, it's to me, it could be a misnomer, because journalists, and you have citizens, not that we are not citizens, but if you as a citizen if you're going to be producing news, what sort of kind of, are you detached from the situation? You're part of the news. Not that it's a bad thing, but I think one needs to actually, and technology gives, puts up this challenge, is that how is one still going to stay relevant? And maybe that's something that we need to chat about.
Yes, no, definitely. And just to touch on your point before we move on to the next question, is that lots of the social media platforms have kind of pushed the envelope or facilitated a means for user-generated content. And I think this is maybe perhaps an agenda of the social media kind of companies and organizations, that they want to keep the content perhaps on the platform. So I think that is definitely an interesting point, and I think it needs further discussion. I just want to move on to the next question, and this is where we touch on social justice versus content consumption for the moment. With the legacy of colonialism, apartheid, land and economic injustice, these are very deep stories. Digital media requires quick shareable content. How do you as an editor find the balance between the two, having perhaps doing a deep dive on an issue that rears its head every time, like the xenophobic attacks, versus something that's on the go, that is topical and that has to, that news item has to go out? How do you find the balance?
So I think I'll respond by very quickly saying how I wouldn't want to be prescriptive and say how not to do it, but how I wouldn't do it. So you spoke about the xenophobic attacks and this wave of xenophobia. So the president of the country, President Cyril Ramaphosa, spoke about it, and of course that's another topic. One can really analyze, did he really address the issue? Was he addressing a problem that was created by a failure? So there was a failure on the one side, created a problem, but that's but that he addressed the nation. the national broadcaster, maybe like many of us, maybe found his presentation a bit boring. So let's liven things up a bit. And they had the leader of March, immediately after that, countering what the president had said. Now, some may argue that's good journalism. You had the president saying, look, this should not be done. You can't take the law into your own hands. So now immediately we get the other side of the story. And this person is saying, well, what we are doing is right and why. So I found that problematic on two counts. One is it's irresponsible because what that particular movement is doing, they're not only endangering lives of people, people have died, people have been killed. That's one. Let's look at the practical effects, the real lived effects of what they're doing, right? People live in fear, etc. So what you do on the one level, you immediately counterpoint what the president is attempting to do. And again, as I said, that one can unpack whatever he said. But here was, the ordinary folk, who really don't want to see people being terrorized, going, you think of Rwanda, etc., and you said, they bring in the person who is actually being criticized. Now, as I said, some would argue that it's good journalism because you bring in the other side. But I say it's irresponsible journalism because, and this is where, the social justice issue comes in. It's when people start talking about, no, we must be objective. And early in my career, and not because of my own sort of thoughts and ideas, it was a kind of training one was given at the coalface. Someone like Mr. James Matthews, for example, he wrote stories, factual, truth-based, no embellishments. If you are a writer, that you've got your facts there, you don't need to embellish your stories. And your style of writing, perhaps keep it simple, etc., all of that. But, he said, you don't. And I think maybe it was easier during our era or when I started because there was apartheid and there was the struggle, And there was no way you would give voice to whoever it was, Jimmy Kruger or B.J. Foster or anyone like that. They were the enemy. They were oppressors, so you don't give voice to the oppressed, to the oppressors rather. You give voice to the oppressed. So we see the situation unfolding in Palestine, for example. So if I were a journalist in Palestine, Gaza, or the West Bank, I would report on home demolishments or a family being driven out of their home. I would speak to a settler, not for their point of view, I just want to extract their madness, I want to extract the kind of hatred they have.
The Meshukaness that they have in them.
Exactly. That's the only reason I would speak to them, not to say, look, okay, they are complaining that you drove them out. So I think the whole question of, the soundbite, for example, yes, it does draw listeners, it draws viewers, it draws clicks. But I think, the long-lasting, and we spoke about longevity, journalism that survives is journalism that's based on truth, that's based on, the social justice agenda is the one that needs to be placed forth. Yes, there's travel journalism and all sorts of things, but we are now talking about, say, general news coverage. And that's the school we came from. And I think if one adheres and sticks to the kind of lessons that one learned in the early stages, there's no danger that you would become irrelevant, because social justice is never ever irrelevant. It stares one in one's face. As I said, maybe in our days it was a bit easier because you could really define the enemy. But now, you look out, you look outside, you see someone scratching in a bin, for example. That's a story, It's not a story that's going to maybe get a lot of clickbaits. But, of course, you need to tell the story in such a way that you want to draw listeners, you want to draw readers, just from a simple bin scratching. So you have residents, on a residents chat group, say, please, where's security? People are scratching in the bin. Yes, people messing, etc. But for a journalist, there's a story beyond that. Why would a person scratch in the bin? Okay, so no, he wants to buy a tick. It's not as easy as that. That's going to, if a journalist thinks in that way, I call it lazy journalism. You what you see is what you get type of thing. That's lazy journalism. A journalist, serious about the craft would look at, bin scratching, and just use that example, and would say, look, there's a story, not a story in the sense that I'll be able to produce smart video clips, etc. Yes, you would eventually. I mean, imagine, focusing in, not showing the person's face. So you need a bit of creative camera work, etc. You need voice. It can be a story that can be very creative. So it's a huge challenge. But I think if one stays true to the craft, one can survive.
So I think I can definitely appreciate that answer from you, and that also tells us why Muslim Views kind of sets a standard here in South Africa and the world to some degree in terms of the standard that it has set itself. I want to touch on content marketing strategy, and for the last 10 years Muslim Views has been on this journey to convergence and to, you do have an audience for print, but also in terms of getting your website going, and lots of your other digital touch points has been in place. And what I have observed is that as a community publication, you have been syndicating lots of your articles at different digital touch points, but the one that stood out was definitely LinkedIn. So why have you chosen LinkedIn over TikTok, and what type of audience segment do you want to tap into? I know there's lots of mechanics behind that in terms of your research and so on, but please just weigh in on this one.
Yeah, just to put it very briefly, so it also comes down to the question of resources. So convergence for us wasn't easy because we, first of all, alhamdulillah, we're not technologically challenged in that sense, but we were not up there with the younger, younger generation of journalists, and I would say younger generation of newsrooms. So I don't want to sound ageist, but there were newsrooms. The Radio 76 newsroom. If one looks at it, compares that to Muslim Views, and I would say that with honor and tribute to Radio 76, it's a young newsroom compared to the Muslim Views one. And we're not talking of the age. We're not talking of a 70-odd-year-old editor and maybe, I don't know, a news editor.
These are all young journalists at the fore.
Right? But they are also young in the sense of the ideas that they bring in, etc. So you could probably have a 70-year-old head of news who would bring in a lot of experience, but that person must be prepared to say, look, I'm open to new ideas, etc. So it can still, so you could still have few people who are past retirement age, and you could still retain the youthfulness, if you want to call it that, of a newsroom. And this, unfortunately, Muslim Views has been grappling with. And the reason being resources, so we're not a community-based. I must get this correctly. We're not an NGO type of organization where you could go on collection drives, etc., or even have bazaars and fairs, etc. It had to be income that's needed to be generated by the newspaper itself. Now we are in NPC, which means people can sign up as members or donate, which makes life a bit easier. But I would give you a very frank answer, Hasanain. It has not been easy. So coming to the question of LinkedIn, why LinkedIn? It was probably easier using that platform on the one score than, say, TikTok. But on the other hand, if you look at the profile of the typical LinkedIn user, we feel that, we are a niche newspaper. Niche, first of all, in a sense, the Muslim community, but it's being read more widely, particularly now with the convergence going on the website. So it's open to everyone, and we can see from the kind of interaction we have. But LinkedIn is also a kind of the profile of the LinkedIn user is something that we feel our type of journalism, the long form journalism, if you want to call it that,
There's an audience there.
There's the audience, we're not going to compete with that, short story, breaking news, for example. We don't have the resources, but even if we had the resources, I, as an editor, would say, let's push those resources into doing a really in-depth piece. So you would have noticed, for example, then driven by my colleague, our CEO, Mahmoud Sangle,
Kudos to him.
Exactly, the 4-page supplements or pull-outs. We did the Clover story, for example. Now, you could have written a 500-word piece on Clover and how they, apart from the fact that, the boycott side of things, but the halal certification and why and what. You can't do that in a 500-word story. We were able to do it, but we had to do 4 pages of it. Yes, graphics, etc. So we use new technology, because that went onto our website, for example, and there will be other multimedia productions coming out of that. And we're using the Clover story, for example, for that. The Zamzam story was also an interesting one, which needed months of investigation. Now, that's the other thing. You can report on an incident, get a quick quote from someone, etc., and push out the story. It'll get the clicks, people will read it, but what impact will it make? Yes, if you have the readership, and there is a readership, and there is a need to actually get news out as it happens, or as soon as it happens. But I think maybe an equally significant kind of need for in-depth news where people can analyze, because that is long-term. So to me, long-form journalism is long-term journalism, really.
So that brings me to my next question, and this is a quest of financial survival. It boggles the mind how the publication has been able to still keep its doors open. So your role in helping audience make sense of the news, people rely on your publication to find out what's happening in the world when it comes to genocide, war, the question of identity for youth, education, and the legacy of apartheid through lots of your pieces that you do, right? And you're achieving all of this, getting the news out there on a budget that is shrinking. If a business or a civil society organization is listening to this media engagement, what specific resource does your organization need? Whether it's in a grant funding or some sort of access to a resource that's going to assist the organization.
Yeah, look, we welcome that with open arms. But one needs to also be clear that it needs to come with no strings attached. So what we have been looking at, are sources of funding, grants, for example, that come from either government support, but not government funding as such. For example, the MDDA funding. So there's legislation which says that publications which or media which serve a particular niche, community base, etc., etc., the legislation says they need to be supported, right? It doesn't necessarily mean the government is now going to say, yeah, we're giving you a grant. It could mean that. But what government is doing is they're accessing that from taxes, maybe levies, which they haven't done. So what a lot of and we belong to the AIP, which is the Association of Independent Publishers. What AIP has pushed is some sort of levy on mainstream media, corporate media. Part of the profits.
CSI.
Exactly. CSI funding should go into a fund which would then support community media like the Radio 76 and other community radio stations. But I think more specifically, you find Naspers, which is now, has this new face, Media 24. And then they've got Novus Print.
Novus Media.
Right. So Novus Media has bought up all these, Pal, Post, etc., all these small companies. So now if you want to print and you want to use web-based printing, there are very few companies. Yes, there are a few small independent ones, but Novus has the monopoly. And are they being taxed? They make huge profits, and I think when we talk of grants and funding, I see it coming from there. You asked, if a civil society or business was listening to this program. Civil society, I would say, they as much in need of funds as we are for their campaigns. But what I would tell civil society is to join us in highlighting issues that need to be highlighted. But I think it's the business community. And I must say, if it were not for the business community, Muslim Views would not have survived. Allah grants us the rizq.
Ameen.
But it takes agency, and the agency, the business community, they've been loyal. I remember, I'm looking from the Muslim Views days, starting off, just a short while ago, we spoke to someone. That person was an advertiser in the very first edition of Muslim Views. And that business advertised in Muslim Views until the very last day when the person decided, look, he needs to rest. And the business did not exist anymore. But I'm sure if the business was handed over under that name to someone, he would have urged that person advertise. So I'm just giving you an example.
Since 1986.
Since 1986
Subhanallah.
Until the day that business closed. And so, and family and friends who noticed that would support that person. They could have maybe got that particular item slightly cheaper somewhere else. But they would go there to that person, says, no, for we want, that person's business needs the barakah. We will be a kind of agency for that barakah by supporting that person because that person had supported Muslim Views. But there are those businesses that support mosques, madrasas, etc., fall into that same kind of category. So, yes, my call would be to businesses. You're there. You'll get the returns as well, and the year after. But I think if you're serious about alternative media, if you're serious about the narrative, we complain about,
Who controls the narrative?
Who controls the narrative. If you're serious about control being in the hands of the oppressed, then you need to support independent media. And that Muslim Views, Radio 76 and several others. And that would be my call to the business community.
There we go. That's the clarion call out there, support. So you started your career at the height of apartheid. You started in the Muslim News newsroom in September 1975 during the height of the student resistance under the guidance of the prolific James Matthews. The apartheid state police was in full sync. The mechanics was in full sync at the time. What did you see on the ground that the reader could never really experience and visualize? You were there on the ground.
Yeah.
What did you see?
So maybe perhaps it's best to illustrate this by way of a story that we did. So it's not hypothetical; it's a real example, right? So when you say 1975, it makes me feel very old.
Like a fossil.
Someone asked me once, when last year it was 50 years. He says, "Oh, okay." I'm not saying that I'm looking very young. He said, "What? Were you about 10 years old when you started?" I said, "No, exactly 21 when I started." But I think people did see the dangers that media, social justice activists and people in the forefront were facing, because the apartheid regime was not subtle in suppressing voices. It was not subtle in shutting down opposition. This is like blatant, the boots and all, right? But often, I think people didn't realize, when they talk specifically to journalists, and we have, I don't want to even start mentioning the names, because they've been like journalists who have been brave in the front line, right there, and they're not often acknowledged, and I don't say, look, and maybe they don't even expect acknowledgement. But I think just out of the goodness of our hearts, we should acknowledge those journalists who operated in that era, because they faced dangers which the public didn't really know about. So I'll give you very quickly, an example of a story that we did. So the old Dompas system, reference book, fancy name, Dompas. So if you were from what is now the Eastern Cape, working in Cape Town, you needed to have your reference book. If you didn't have your reference book, these khaki-clad police, as I want to quote Bob Marley, I like that line of his, brutality dressed in uniform.
Here we go.
A brilliant line.
Here we go.
And they would push you into the back of a van, etc., and take you to a police station, wherever, pay an admission of guilt fine, and then almost like expect you to exile yourself or deport yourself back to the Eastern Cape. Right? Now, a lot of business people employed what we now say undocumented, and one mustn't conflate the two, but at the same time, what one is seeing, where people from on the ground are going around asking people for papers, and that for us who covered those stories, it's frightening, it's scary.
You're reliving the Dompas era.
Exactly.
In 2026.
So brutality in uniform would come and say, "Varas your Dompas," type of thing. And so we covered a story, and the story was someone tipped us off, and he says, group of business people in certain areas, what they are doing is, because the businesses were also fined for employing a person without a pass. I don't want to use the word undocumented.
Or a madam that had an undocumented Cha,
right?
She was marched out.
But in this particular case, it was this group of businessmen, and they sort of identified, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then I did the story, and I was told, I went out and I spoke to them, and they confirmed. The story was the Bantu Affairs Administration Board, which did this job. They used to take bribes from the business persons. So instead of paying a 50 Rand fine, which was a lot of money, I'm talking the early 80s, they would some businesses would give the guy a pack of cigarettes, or a 10 Rand. So they get scot-free, but the people that they employed would be locked up. And we ran the story, The story was framed in such a way, and because we felt the business people were paying the bribe, At that point,
they were complicit.
Yes, but importantly, and this is where I think the story became a bit tricky. But I think, alhamdulillah, with Mr. James Matthews and others, we didn't want to project the business people as the culprits. They were probably created by, they were created, or they were this corruption was given rise to by an evil system. I'm not saying that corruption is justified, or they were absolutely not justified, but we had to balance it. We wanted to focus on the Bantu Affairs system. So it wasn't about taking bribes. We wanted to project and show readers the evil of the system.
And rightfully so,
Right?
because our only source of news was the SABC,
Exactly.
which sanitized the news.
Right? So we could have focused on bribery, etc. But what we chose to do rather was to focus on the system. Right? The kind of dangers that were there was, harassment from the police, because we had to ask them questions, etc. And the final thing, which eventually led to the closure of Muslim News, was I was driving one day, and it was, before the SAFM days. I think it was called English Radio, News on English Radio. And the 3 o'clock news bulletin announced that a publication in Athlone, its editor, the publishers, the printers, etc., have been sued for 2 million rands or something by the Bantu Affairs Board. And I said, that's us, So we made the news. And it took a long legal battle. We had a great legal team. In fact, advocate who eventually became Chief Justice, Advocate Mohammed, he was on the legal team. Tala Umar was the...
Ismail Mohammed.
Yes, Ismail.
Former first black Chief Justice.
Yes. He was our senior counsel in that case. And Tala Umar was the instructing attorney. And in fact, he wasn't a junior counsel, but he was... It was like what one would say, a crack team. We had Benny Keys.
Wow.
So, but with this heavyweight team, it was during apartheid era, justice wasn't dealt with. But what they did manage to do, and, Advocate Mohammed came to the fore, was that they eventually threw the case out of court. But it cost us a lot of money, and not so much the attorneys, because people say, did the advocate and attorney make a lot of money? No. We had to pay the costs of legal counsel of the Bantu Affairs Administration Board. I don't even think we didn't pay Tala Umar. He said, wait, first settle. Of course, we paid the travel costs of Ismail Mohammed. He would come, once, twice a week. Not a week, but we came down.
From Johannesburg?
From Pretoria. I was based in Pretoria at that time. But what did happen was we had to pay the legal costs of, and I still remember, I think the company was called De Klerk and Gevind, or Vint and De Klerk. It was a firm based in Bellville. And that just drained our resources. So, yes, the dangers, maybe the readers, the public didn't know about that, the frustration. And then what happens is that as a young journalist, there are people around you who say, look, you shouldn't have done that story. Look where you have landed the paper in. And sometimes, I don't say I sit with the guilt, but I did the story, and maybe one of the factors that led to the closure of Muslim News. So maybe you do sit with a certain amount of guilt, but then you say, no, you did it for a cause, So, and, journalists, I think, when you cover stories of trauma, etc., we don't counsel our journalists. We don't, when someone comes back from a story, now, say you'd send your journalist out to cover gangland shooting or something. I'm been journalism 5 decades. But if I see a little clip, and like the other day, I saw a clip of a young guy, he's just like an ordinary guy. And then I saw him pulling out this gun and, it disturbed me. It was stomach churning, after all these years, there was a scene in Klipfontein Road in 1976, and we're talking about 76. But this was in September 76. I remember the time. Clifffontein Road was deserted. It didn't have, the service road was the main road. There was no dual road.
There was no main Clifffontein Road.
So the service road that we're using, that was the main road. And the only vehicles on the road were the riot trucks,
The
right?
Caspers,
The Caspers, right? And then on the corner of Second Avenue, First Avenue, and Clifffontein Road, we saw a guy being dumped into the back of a Casper, Kayoum, my colleague, and I mean, his guts were lying out. 50 years later, I drive past that point. I still think about that, Yes, maybe I had strong colleagues who could chat to me. But I think if there's a message I would want to give to young newsrooms is chat to your journalists after they come back from a story. How is the experience, because sometimes you don't realize that trauma actually lives on, and it can be disturbing. It kind of shakes you. So yeah, maybe we're moving away from marketing and that, but this, sometimes we're so focused on marketing our news, we lose sight of that human element that creates the news. And therefore I say, citizen journalism, fine, you can put a TikTok thing or put something on Instagram. You're not accountable for it because you're not a journalist. But if you're a journalist, whatever you put out there on radio, TV, newspaper, even as a Facebook post or an Instagram post, but if you're a journalist, you are held accountable for that.
Yeah, well, so I think that brings up lots of pain, and it's deep-seated in our recesses as yourself as a media professional, but in our collective memory, if you recall back to the 1970s, the student uprising during the state of emergency, Belgravia and Thornton Road, the roads can tell the story of tire barricades. So lots of this is deep in our recess. I think we can go on and on. I think we need to have a follow-up discussion with you. I think you've got some rich experiences there. But our discussion was one that was of great value. We touched on business, editorial integrity, platform strategy of the publication. So I thank you for you sharing your journey, the origin story of Muslim news and Muslim views, and certainly yours and your publication has played a key role in putting high on the agenda some of the atrocities of the state police, and you continue to play a key role in our community, and long may your publication continue. So that's it from my side. Hasanain, we will meet up with you again. We'll have another installment of the Media and Marketing Show. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.